The man on the auction block was not a man at all. He was a broker, his face smooth and his words smoother, but the thing he sold was a life. Her life. Alara stood beside him on the splintered wood of the platform, a sack of flour with a price tag. The crowd below was a blur of faces, some curious, some cruel, most just bored. They were farmers and merchants, their wives in their Sunday best, gathered in the dusty town square for the monthly livestock and surplus auction. Today, she was the surplus. A strong back, the broker called out, his voice a practiced boom that carried over the shuffling feet and low murmurs. Wide-hipped and sturdy, not a beauty. You can see that for yourselves, but she can work from sunup to sundown without complaint. Laughter rippled through the front rows. It was a thin, sharp sound that pricked at the wall she had built inside her chest. Alara stared at a loose nail in the floorboards. She focused on the rust bleeding into the pale wood. She did not look at the faces. She knew what she would see there. Pity from the women, a speculative glint from the men. The same look a man gives a plow horse before checking its teeth. Her own father had stood her on this block. He had taken the broker's initial fee, a handful of silver coins that clinked with finality in his worn leather pouch, and he had walked away without looking back. He had called it a contract of indenture. The broker called it an opportunity. The townspeople called it a shame. Alara called it Tuesday. Bread for labor, not for conversation. The broker continued, winking at a portly man in a sweat-stained hat. Guaranteed obedient. Her father assures me she has no troublesome ideas in her head. That was the lie that broke the dam. Something hot and sharp, like swallowing a shard of glass, surged up her throat. An idea. She had an idea. She had 1,000 of them, 1,000,000, a universe of ideas and thoughts and calculations that churned behind her plain face, a secret world no one had ever bothered to look for. She had an idea right now. It was a simple, furious thought. He was wrong. Alara lifted her head. She met the broker's slick, satisfied gaze. Then she looked past him, out at the sea of onlookers. She found the face of the portly man, the one who had chuckled the loudest. She held his gaze until he shifted, suddenly uncomfortable, his smile wilting. "I am not an animal," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was low and rough from disuse, but in a momentary lull, it carried. The broker's smile tightened. "Quiet girl. I can read and write," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She looked from one face to another, forcing them to see her, to see the person behind the description. "I can do some faster than any man in this square. I know the soil and the water. I know why the north pasture floods and the west field goes dry." A nervous titter went through the crowd. This was not part of the show. The broker grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "That's enough." "Is it?" she shot back, yanking her arm free. The sudden, sharp movement surprised him. It surprised her. "Is my worth only in my back? Is there no value in a mind? Or do you only value what you can easily understand?" The square was silent now. The boredom was gone. The cruelty had been replaced by a shocked, focused attention. This was worse. She had made a spectacle of herself. She had confirmed her otherness, her troublesome nature. She had taken her humiliation and set it on fire. The broker's face was a mask of fury. He lowered his voice to a venomous hiss. "You have just made yourself worthless. No one wants a talking mule." He turned to the crowd, forcing a jovial tone that did not reach his eyes. "A bit of spirit. We'll knock a few dollars off for the trouble of breaking her in. Who will start the bidding? A bargain, I assure you." Silence. Absolute, damning silence. The portly man looked at his boots. The women pulled their shawls tighter. The moment of confrontation had passed, and all that remained was the deep, resonant awkwardness of her defiance. She had not saved herself. She had only made her cage smaller. The broker, defeated and furious, declared the auction for this particular lot closed. He shoved her off the platform. "Wait by the livery," he spat. "I'll find someone to take you, even if I have to pay them." Alara stumbled on the uneven ground, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She did not run. She walked. She walked with her head held high, a pointless, painful act of pride, past the silent rows of her neighbors. She did not look at them. She did not need to. She could feel their judgment like the heat of the noon sun on her skin. She found the narrow, manure-scented alley between the livery and the blacksmith shop. The sounds of the auction started up again, a different item, a different life. The world moved on. Here, in the shadows, hidden from view, the wall inside her finally crumbled. It did not fall in a great rush, but in a slow, agonizing slide of stones and mortar. A single sob escaped her, then another. They were dry, racking things, torn from a place so deep she had forgotten it existed. She pressed her forehead against the rough, cool wood of the livery wall. The tears came then, hot and cleansing, not tears of sadness, but of pure, undiluted rage. Rage at her father, at the broker, at the town, at a world that had measured her and found her wanting in all the ways that did not matter. She cried for the girl who loved numbers. She cried for the girl who understood the secret language of water moving under the earth. She cried for the person she was, trapped inside the body they despised. When the tears stopped, a cold, hard clarity remained. She made a vow. It was not a plea to a higher power. It was a promise to herself, forged in the fire of her humiliation. Never again. Never again would she trust the word of a man who held power over her. Never again would she hope for kindness where there was only transaction. Never again would she show them the part of her that thought and felt and knew. She would be a talking mule. She would be a sack of flour. She would be a strong back. She would survive, but she would do it alone, locked inside the fortress of herself. Her heart was now a stone, and she would let no one near enough to see if it could still bleed. She would rely on Alara, and no one else. Chug. Footsteps echoed in the alley. Heavy, unhurried steps. Alara straightened up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She composed her features into a mask of blank indifference. A man appeared at the mouth of the alley, his frame blocking the harsh sunlight. He was tall and broad, dressed not in the Sunday clothes of the townsfolk, but in the functional, dusty attire of a man who worked the land. His hat was weathered, the brim softened by sun and rain. He stopped a respectful distance away. He took off his hat. It was a small gesture, but it was so unexpected it felt like a thunderclap. "The broker's name is Thompson," the man said. His voice was low and even, like the rumble of distant thunder. "He said you were difficult." Alara said nothing. She watched him, her new vow a shield around her heart. "He said you had troublesome ideas," the man continued, his eyes not on her face, but on the alley wall beside her, as if giving her space. "He said you were of no value now. And you are here to agree with him?" Alara's voice was flat. The man's gaze finally met hers. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and clear. They were not leering or pitying. They were assessing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending, calculating what was needed, without immediate judgment. "No," he said, a single, definitive word. "I am here because Thompson is a fool." He paused, letting the statement settle in the still, hot air. "I am Silas," he said. "I settled your father's contract with Thompson." Alara's breath caught. Settled. A clean, financial term. She was bought. The vow in her chest screamed betrayal. "I am not for sale," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I know," Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. "I did not buy you. I bought a piece of paper that gave a bad man power over you. The paper is mine now, which means the power is gone." She stared at him, searching for the trick. There was always a trick. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "I run a ranch north of here, the Whispering Creek. It's failing," he said, with a blunt honesty that was more disarming than any lie. "I need help, not just a strong back. I heard what you said on the platform. About the water, about the soil." He took a step closer, but stopped when he saw her flinch. "I will offer you a room. It has a lock on the inside. You will have the key," he said, speaking slowly, deliberately, as if laying out terms of a treaty. "I will pay you a fair wage for any work you do. You are free to leave at any time. Walk away tomorrow if you choose. No one will stop you." Alara's mind raced, turning his words over and over, looking for the lie, the hook, the hidden clause. Freedom, wages, a lock on the inside. These were concepts from a foreign language. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. It was the only question that mattered. Silas put his hat back on, shading his face. Because Thompson was going to sell your contract to the mining camp foreman. And no one deserves that, he paused. And because I am out of ideas of my own. Maybe you have one I can borrow. The simple admission of need, of fallibility, was the most dangerous thing he could have said. It bypassed her defenses, poking at the softest, most vulnerable part of her. She hardened herself against it. I trust no one, she said, the words of her vow spoken aloud. Especially men who make promises. Good, Silas said, with a nod that seemed to agree with her caution. Don't trust me. Trust what I do. He gestured with his head back toward the square. My wagon is over there. The choice is yours. Stay here and wait for whatever comes next, or ride with me and see if I am a liar. He turned and began to walk away, not looking back to see if she would follow. He was leaving the choice entirely to her. It was the first real choice she had been given all day, all year, maybe all her life. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. Fear and suspicion warred with a tiny, desperate flicker of something she had long since extinguished, hope. He reached the end of the alley and paused, his back still to her. Are you hungry? He asked, the question so simple, so mundane, it cut through the noise in her head. She was starving. The shame of the morning had been a hollow ache in her stomach. There's bread and an apple in the wagon, he said, and then he was gone, stepping out into the light. Alara stood alone in the shadows. She could stay. She could let the broker find some other awful fate for her. Or she could follow the strange, quiet man who offered a lock and a wage and a question about her hunger. She took a single, hesitant step. Then another. She walked out of the alley and into the sun, her vow clutched tight in her hand like a stone, her heart hammering a rhythm of pure, terrifying uncertainty. The wagon was old, the wood weathered to a silver gray. A single, sturdy horse stood patiently in its harness. Silas was on the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, not looking at her. He had left the space beside him empty. On the seat was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She climbed up, her movements stiff and awkward. He did not speak. He simply clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the town that had been her prison. As the last buildings fell away, replaced by open, rolling hills, Alara slowly reached for the cloth bundle. Inside was a thick slice of dark bread and a red, polished apple. She waited for him to say something, to watch her, to judge. He kept his eyes on the road. In the privacy of his silence, she took a bite of the bread. It was dense and wholesome, tasting of molasses and grain. It tasted like sustenance. It tasted like respect. A single, hot tear she had not expected traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away, angry at her own weakness. But as the wagon rumbled on, carrying her toward an unknown future, she held the half-eaten bread in her lap and allowed herself to feel, for the first time, not the ache of hunger, but the simple, profound relief of being fed. Cha! The Whispering Creek Ranch was aptly named. It whispered of neglect. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The ranch house was a simple, sturdy structure, but it sagged in places. A shutter hung from a single hinge. The yard was a riot of overgrown weeds and discarded equipment. A broken wagon leaned against a fence post like a tired old man. It was a place of deep, structural sadness. It reflected the man who brought her here. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. Two younger men, barely out of their teens, emerged from the barn, their faces curious and wary. An older man with a face like a weathered boot and eyes that missed nothing watched from the doorway of the bunkhouse. This is Alara, Silas said to them all, his voice leaving no room for questions. She'll be working with us. Jeb, show her to the spare room in the house. The boys will handle the horse. The old man, Jeb, grunted in acknowledgement. He looked at Alara, his gaze lingering for a moment, sharp and analytical. It was not the look she was used to. It was the look of a man assessing a tool, not for its beauty, but for its use. He turned and shuffled into the house without a word. Alara followed. The inside was worse than the outside. It smelled of dust and stale air and loneliness. Dishes were piled in a basin of greasy water. A layer of grime covered every surface. It was a house without a heart, a place for sleeping, not for living. Jeb led her to a small room at the back. It was sparse, containing only a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a small, rickety table. But the window looked out over the rolling hills, and the door had a small, iron bolt. "Keys in the lock," Jeb said, his voice a dry rasp. He pointed a gnarled finger at it. "Silas said to tell you." He stood there for a moment, as if waiting for something. Alara met his gaze. "Thank you." He grunted again, a sound of mild surprise, and then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. Left alone, Alara walked to the door and slid the bolt home. The solid thunk of the iron was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She went to the window and looked out at the land. It was beautiful, wild country, but she saw more than the beauty. She saw the way the water had cut deep ravines into the northern slopes, carrying away the good soil. She saw the pale, sun-bleached grass in the pastures closest to the house, a sign of shallow roots and exhausted ground. This place was dying, and she was in the middle of it. The next morning, she rose before the sun. She did not know what work Silas expected of her. He had not said. So she gave herself a job. She started with the kitchen. It was a methodical, silent battle. She heated water on the wood stove, scrubbed the grime from the floorboards, washed every last dish and pot until they gleamed. She found a sack of flour, half a bag of beans, and some salted pork. The cupboards were a study in bachelorhood, sparse and chaotic. She organized them. She found a small, neglected garden patch behind the house, choked with weeds, but with a few tenacious herbs still fighting for life. She cleared it, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. She worked without stopping, fueled by a lifetime of being told her only worth was in labor. Here, now, she would make that labor her shield and her voice. She would impose order on this small corner of chaos, because it was the only thing she could control. When Silas and the other men came in from their morning chores, they stopped dead in the doorway. The kitchen was transformed. It was clean. It was organized. It smelled of soap and wood smoke and something else. Cornbread. A pan of golden brown cornbread sat cooling on the countertop. A pot of beans simmered on the stove. The two young hands, whose names she learned were Billy and Finn, stared with wide, unbelieving eyes. Jeb, the old foreman, looked from the clean counters to the simmering pot, and then to Alara. He said nothing, but a single, surprised huh escaped his lips. Silas looked around the room slowly. His gaze took in every detail. The clean floor, the stacked dishes, the neatly arranged shelves. Finally, his eyes landed on the cornbread. He walked over to it. He broke off a small piece from the corner. He put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Alara's heart pounded. She waited for the verdict. For a complaint. For a dismissal. Silas swallowed. "Who baked this cornbread?" he asked, his voice quiet, directed at the room but intended for her. The young hands looked at her. Jeb looked at her. She braced herself. "I did," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded slowly. He looked directly at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than assessment in his eyes. It was a flicker of genuine, unmasked surprise. And something else. Respect. "It's good," he said. It was just a statement. 2 simple words. But in the silent, broken house of the Whispering Creek Ranch, it felt like a speech. It felt like a foundation stone being laid. Supper that night was a quiet affair. The men ate with a hunger that spoke of long days and meager meals. They ate her beans and her cornbread, and no one spoke, but the silence was different. It was not the empty, lonely silence of before. It was a silence filled with the sound of scraping forks and satisfied sighs. It was the silence of a home. WG. The days settled into a rhythm. Alara claimed the house and the garden as her domain. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended. She brought a quiet, relentless order to the chaos. The men, in turn, began to change. They started wiping their boots before coming inside. Billy, the younger of the two hands, started leaving wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Finn began to talk to her, asking questions about her cooking, about the herbs in her garden. Jeb remained silent, but she would often find a bucket of fresh water left for her by the back door, or a pile of neatly chopped kindling for the stove. Acts of service, his only language. And Silas watched. He watched her work, his pale eyes missing nothing. He ate her meals, his quiet supper was good, becoming a nightly ritual, a small, solid affirmation of her place. But the ranch was still dying. She could feel it in the weary slump of Silas's shoulders at the end of the day. She could hear it in the worried, low-toned conversations between him and Jeb that stopped whenever she entered a room. The problem was the water. The creek that gave the ranch its name was running low, a pale shadow of what it should be. The upper pastures were turning to dust. One afternoon, she found Silas, Jeb, and the boys standing by the main irrigation ditch. It was bone dry. They had spent the morning trying to clear what they thought was a blockage upstream, but had found nothing. The springs choked, Billy said, frustration in his voice. Just gone dry. Springs don't just go dry in a week, Jeb grumbled, kicking at the dry dirt. Something's wrong upstream. I've walked the whole creek line on our property, Silas said, his voice tight with strain. There's nothing. No rockfall. No blockage. The water is just gone. They stood in defeated silence, staring at the useless ditch. Alara had been watching from a distance, hesitant to intrude on their work. But she had seen this before, on her father's land, a lifetime ago. She took a breath and stepped forward. You're looking in the wrong place, she said quietly. For heads turned to look at her, for pairs of eyes filled with varying degrees of surprise. The problem isn't in the creek, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke of what she knew. It's under it. She pointed to a line of willow trees about 100 yards away, growing in a gentle depression in the land. The water table here runs through limestone. Sometimes, a fissure opens up underground. A sinkhole. The creek finds it, and it drains away, like pulling the plug in a basin. Jeb stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Billy and Finn exchanged a look of pure confusion. Silas's gaze was sharp, focused. A sinkhole? Here. It happened on my father's land once, Alara explained. The stream vanished overnight. Everyone thought the spring had failed, but I followed the damp soil. The water was going down, not getting blocked up, she pointed again. Your creek bed is dry, but the ground around those willows will be soft. Spongy. There was a moment of silence. The idea was so alien to their understanding of the land. Silas looked at the willows. Then he looked at her. He saw not a cook, not a housekeeper, but someone who spoke the language of the earth itself. Show me, he said. She led the way, the 4 men following her like a small, skeptical army. As they approached the depression, the ground did indeed change. The dry, cracked earth gave way to softer soil. Near the base of the largest willow, the ground was visibly damp. Jeb knelt, pressing his hand into the earth. He pulled it back, his palm muddy. He looked up at Alara, his weathered face a mask of astonishment. I'll be damned, he breathed. They spent the rest of the afternoon digging. Sure enough, a few feet down, they found the mouth of a narrow, water-slicked fissure in the rock. The creek was pouring itself into the belly of the earth. The solution was brutal, back-breaking work. They had to haul clay and rock from another part of the ranch to create a dam, plugging the sinkhole and forcing the creek back into its rightful channel. Alara worked alongside them. She did not have their strength, but she had a relentless stamina. She shoveled dirt, hauled rocks, her body aching but her mind clear and focused. She was not just a helper. She was the architect of this salvation. By dusk, it was done. A trickle of water appeared in the dry irrigation ditch. Then it grew to a steady, life-giving flow. The 4 men stood, covered in mud and sweat, staring at the water as if it were a miracle. Billy whooped with joy. Finn slapped him on the back. Jeb just stood there, shaking his head slowly, looking from the water to Alara and back again. Silas walked over to where she stood, leaning on her shovel, catching her breath. He stood before her, his face streaked with mud, his eyes clear and bright in the fading light. He did not thank her. The word was too small. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, and asked a question that changed everything. What else can you do? Chug. The question hung in the air for a week. Silas did not press her. He simply let it be, an open door she could choose to walk through. During that week, something shifted on the ranch. The water flowed. The pastures began to recover their color. But more than that, the way the men looked at her had changed. Billy and Finn now asked for her opinion on things, the mending of a harness, the sighting of a new fence line. Jeb started talking to her. Not much, just a few words here and there. A comment on the weather, a question about the soil in the garden. For Jeb, it was the equivalent of an oration. She was no longer just the woman who cooked the cornbread. She was the woman who had saved the water. One evening, after another quiet, satisfying supper, Silas stayed at the table after the others had left. He pushed a large, leather-bound ledger across the table toward her. "This is my other problem," he said. "The water was one thing. The money is another." Alara looked at the book. It was old, the cover worn smooth. It represented the heart of the ranch, its financial lifeblood. "I am losing money," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "Every month, I end up with less than I started with. The cattle prices are decent. My costs haven't gone up, but the numbers don't add up. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." He leaned back in his chair, his face tired in the lamplight. "I am a rancher, Alara. I understand cattle and land. I do not understand numbers on a page. They swim in front of my eyes." He tapped the ledger. "You said you could do sums." It was a test. It was a plea. It was an act of profound trust. He was handing her the keys to his failure, his vulnerability, and asking her to make sense of it. Her vow screamed at her. Never trust. Never reveal. But Silas was not her father. He was not the broker. He was the man who had asked if she was hungry. He was the man who had given her a key. He was the man who had looked at her mind and asked to see more. She pulled the ledger toward her. "I will look," she said. For the next 3 nights, Alara lived in the world of the ledger. She lit a lamp after the house was quiet, and she sat at the kitchen table, the numbers her only companions. At first, she saw what Silas saw, a slow, inexplicable decline. Sales recorded, expenses paid, but a steady drain on the final tally. But Alara did not just see numbers. She saw patterns. She got the ledgers from the previous years. She laid them out, comparing them page by page, entry by entry. She was a detective, and the crime was written in ink. On the 4th night, she found it. It was not one big thing. It was 100 small things. An invoice for fence wire that was 10% higher than the year before from the same supplier. A bill for veterinary services for a sickness the cattle had never had. A sale of 3 steers where the recorded weight was subtly, almost invisibly, altered. Each one was a tiny cut, a single drop of blood. But together, they were bleeding the ranch dry. And on many of the suspicious invoices, on the delivery slips for feed that seemed too expensive, on the receipts for phantom repairs, there was a notation. A small, neat signature of authorization. A. Finch. Alastair Finch. She knew the name. He owned the sprawling, prosperous ranch to the east. Silas had mentioned him once, calling him a good neighbor, a friend who helped him secure deals in town. A friend. Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was not a leak. This was sabotage. A deliberate, systematic, and patient destruction of Silas's livelihood by a man he trusted. She sat back, the enormity of the betrayal washing over her. She felt a protective fury on Silas's behalf that startled her with its intensity. The next day, a shiny black buggy pulled into the yard. A man stepped out. He was handsome in a polished, manicured way. He wore tailored clothes that were clean despite the dust, and his boots shone. It was Alastair Finch. He strode toward the house as if he owned it, a confident, easy smile on his face. Silas and Jeb, who had been repairing a corral, walked over to meet him. "Silas, my friend." Finch's voice was warm and booming. "Just came to see how you were faring. I heard you had some water trouble." "We managed it," Silas said, his voice neutral. Finch's eyes scanned the property, a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossing his features as he saw the greening pastures. Then his gaze landed on Alara, who was standing on the porch, watching. His smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. Well, and who is this? Don't tell me you've finally hired some proper help for that disaster of a kitchen, Silas." He walked toward the porch, his eyes raking over Alara, dismissing her, categorizing her. Then a look of recognition dawned on his face. A cruel, knowing smirk. "Wait a moment," he said, snapping his fingers. "I know you. You're the talking mule from the auction." The words hit her like a physical blow. He said them loud enough for Jeb and Silas to hear clearly. He was marking his territory. He was reminding her of her place. He was telling Silas that he had brought shame and lowliness onto his property. Caused quite a stir, as I recall. Finch continued, enjoying himself. All that shouting about sums and soil. A real spectacle. Alara stood frozen, the humiliation of that day rushing back, hot and suffocating. She could feel Silas's eyes on her, feel Jeb's stillness. She wanted to run, to hide, to become invisible. But then she thought of the ledger. She thought of the slow, patient poison he had been feeding his friend for years. She lifted her chin. She met Alistair Finch's mocking gaze. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and cold. "I am the woman who understands sums." Finch's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. It was not the cowed, shamed response he had expected. He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Well, Silas, I hope she's better at cooking than she is at making friends." He clapped Silas on the shoulder. "You have to be careful who you let into your home. Desperate people do desperate things." It was a threat, wrapped in a friendly warning. Silas did not react. He simply looked from Finch to Alara, his face an unreadable mask. "Alara is my guest," Silas said, his voice quiet, but with an edge of steel that made Finch's hand drop from his shoulder. Finch's eyes narrowed. He had sensed the shift in the dynamic. He saw the wall of Silas's quiet protection, and he saw Alara standing behind it, unbroken. He had come to assess the damage from his failed water gambit and found a new, unexpected variable. Her. "Of course," Finch said, his charm sliding back into place like a well-oiled machine. "Just looking out for you, my friend. As always." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both polite and insulting, and strode back to his buggy, a man entirely confident in his power. As he rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake, Alara knew one thing with absolute certainty. The war for the Whispering Creek Ranch had just begun, and Alistair Finch had just met his real enemy. It was not Silas. It was the talking mule. Cha. That night, the air in the ranch house was thick with unspoken tension. After the others had gone to the bunkhouse, Alara laid the ledgers on the kitchen table. She placed a single sheet of paper beside them, covered in her neat, precise columns of figures. Silas sat opposite her, his face grim. "It's Finch," she said, her voice low. There was no need for preamble. She walked him through it, page by page, entry by entry. She showed him the inflated invoices, the phantom repairs, the altered weights. She showed him the pattern, the slow, deliberate bleed, and the signature that tied it all together. "He has been stealing from you for years," she concluded, her voice devoid of emotion. She presented it as data, not as a betrayal. "Not just stealing. He's been trying to break you, to force you to sell." Silas stared at the ledger, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. A muscle jumped in his jaw. The silence in the room was heavy, dangerous. She could almost hear him planning it. A horse, a gun, a ride to a neighboring ranch in the dead of night. The kind of swift, foolish, masculine justice that would solve nothing and cost him everything. "I'll kill him," he said, the words a low growl. "No," Alara said, her voice sharp. He looked up, his pale eyes blazing with a cold fire. "He is a thief and a snake. He called me his friend. And if you ride over there and confront him, you will be a murderer," she countered, her voice steady. "He is a rich man, a respected man in the town that laughed at me. Who do you think they will believe? The wealthy landowner, or the failing rancher and his talking mule?" She used Finch's own insult as a weapon, a dose of cold reality. Silas flinched, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly, replaced by a weary frustration. "Then what? I let him get away with it." "No," she said again. "You don't let him get away with it. We don't let him get away with it." The word hung in the air between them. "We." Silas heard it. His gaze softened, the fury replaced by a deep, listening stillness. "He thinks he is smart," Alara continued, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He thinks he is fighting you, a man he considers simple. He does not know he is fighting me. He thinks I am just a piece of property you acquired. He underestimates me. That is his weakness. That is our advantage." She tapped the sheet of paper with her figures. "A man like Finch doesn't lose to a fist fight. He loses to a better set of books. He loses in public, where his reputation is everything. We will not give him the fight he wants. We will give him the one he cannot win." Her plan was simple and quiet. They would gather more evidence. They would find the original copies of the invoices in town. They would talk to the suppliers. They would build a case so solid, so irrefutable that when they finally revealed it, Finch would have nowhere to hide. "We do nothing for now," she said. "We act as if we suspect nothing. We let him think he is still in control." Silas stared at her, a long, searching look. He saw the fire in her eyes, the fierce intelligence, the strategic mind that saw 10 moves ahead. He had asked to borrow an idea. She was offering him a war plan. He gave a single, slow nod. "We," he repeated softly, sealing the alliance. But Finch was not a man who waited. He had sensed the new steel in Silas, the quiet defiance in Alara. He knew something had shifted. And so he escalated. The rumors started a week later. They drifted back from town with Billy when he went to pick up supplies. Whispers that Silas had taken in a woman of low character, that she was more than just a housekeeper, that he was a fool, taken in by a conniving, desperate woman. The rumors were aimed at Alara, but they were designed to wound Silas, to isolate him from the community, to paint him as pathetic. Alara heard them in the way Billy wouldn't meet her eyes, in the way Finn fell silent when she entered the barn. She ignored them. She had been judged by these people her whole life. Their opinions were nothing but wind. Then the attacks became more direct. A section of fence was cut one night, and a dozen steers wandered onto Finch's land. He had the sheriff issue a formal warning and a fine for trespassing livestock, a public record of Silas's supposed incompetence. A few days later, the well near the bunkhouse was fouled. Someone had dumped a carcass in it overnight. It was a vicious, petty act of sabotage that cost them a day of hard, foul labor to clean. Through it all, Alara and Silas held to their plan. They said nothing. They showed nothing. They quietly gathered their proof. Alara made a secret trip to town, speaking to a clerk at the supply store who had long been underpaid and overlooked by Finch. She came back with copies of the real invoices, a stark contrast to the forgeries in Silas's ledger. But the psychological toll was mounting. Alara felt the weight of the ranch's troubles settling on her shoulders. She had come here to escape being a burden, and now she felt like the cause of all this new strife. Finch had not escalated his attacks until after she had arrived. Her deepest insecurity, the one planted by her father and nurtured by the town, began to sprout again in the dark. The belief that she was a curse, that she brought trouble wherever she went. The breaking point came on a Saturday. She had ridden into town with Jeb to sell some of the vegetables and herbs from her now thriving garden. As she stood behind her small stall in the market, the same square where she had been auctioned, she overheard 2 women talking. The same women who had watched her humiliation with pitying eyes. "That's her," one said, her voice a stage whisper. "The one living out at the Whispering Creek. Poor Silas. His father must be rolling in his grave. First his ranch fails, now he takes in that. Alistair Finch told my husband that the man is bewitched," the other replied. "The woman has him wrapped around her little finger. Finch says he tried to warn him, but he won't listen. It's a shame. Such a good man, brought low by trash." Trash. The word echoed the broker's pronouncement. Worthless. It confirmed everything she feared. She was not helping Silas. She was poisoning him. Her presence was the weapon Finch was using to destroy him. She sold the last of her vegetables, her hands moving mechanically, her face a blank mask. Jeb, who had heard it too, watched her, his face creased with a worry he could not voice. On the ride back, she was silent. The decision formed in her mind, cold and hard and painful. She would leave. It was the only way to save him. She would remove herself from the equation. She would take the trouble she had brought and carry it away with her. Back at the ranch, she went to her room. The room with the lock. The room that had been her first taste of safety. She began to pack her few belongings into a small bundle. Her spare dress. The book of sums her mother had given her long ago. She would leave tonight, after they were all asleep. She would walk away, just as Silas had said she could. She was folding her dress when the shouting started outside. A frantic, terrified yell. "Fire! The barn is on fire!" Alara dropped the dress and ran. She burst out of the house into a nightmare. The big hay barn, the heart of the ranch's winter stores, was engulfed in flames. An oily black smoke poured into the twilight sky. Silas and Jeb were already there, buckets in hand, their efforts futile against the raging inferno. "Finn!" Billy screamed, his face pale with terror. "Finn is in there. He went in to get the new full. Silas stopped dead. He looked at the burning barn, a wall of impossible heat and collapsing timbers. He looked at the desperate, hopeless line of men with their useless buckets. Then he looked at Billy's terrified face. He dropped his bucket. "Get the horses out of the corral," he yelled, his voice a raw command. "Get them to the far pasture. Now." Without a second's hesitation, he soaked a rag in the water trough, tied it around his face, and ran toward the burning maw of the barn. "Silas, no," Jeb yelled, but he was already gone, disappearing into the smoke and flames. Alara stood frozen, her plan to leave turning to ash in her throat. She was going to run away to save him, and he was running into a fire to save one of his men. The difference in their character, in their courage, struck her with the force of a physical blow. A moment later, which felt like an eternity, Silas emerged from the smoke. He was half carrying, half dragging Finn, who was coughing and sputtering but alive. The foal scrambled out behind them, terrified but unharmed. Silas collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his arm burned and his face black with soot. The barn roof groaned, and then fell in on itself with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of sparks into the darkening sky. Everything was gone. The winter hay, the stored grain, their future. Later, after the fire had burned itself out, leaving a smoldering, black skeleton against the stars, Alara found Silas by the creek, washing the soot from his face and arms. She had the bundle of her belongings in her hand. "I was leaving," she said, her voice shaking. He did not look at her. He just continued to splash the cold water on his burned skin. "I heard the women in town," she said, the words spilling out of her. "They said I was trash, that I was bringing you down. And they are right. This is Finch's doing, but I am his excuse. The fire, it's because of me. If I go, he will have no reason to." "You think this is about you?" Silas interrupted, his voice rough with smoke and anger. He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing in the moonlight. "He doesn't want you gone, Alara. He wants my land. He wanted it long before you came. He was just bleeding me slowly. You just made him impatient." He took a step toward her, his anger so potent it was a palpable force. "Do you have any idea what you are worth?" he asked, his voice low and fierce. "You came to a place that was broken, and you started to mend it. You gave us back our water. You gave us back our dignity. You sit in a filthy kitchen and make it a home. You look at a book of lies and you find the truth." He gestured with his good arm toward the smoldering ruins of the barn. "He can burn my barn. He can steal my cattle. He can turn the whole damn town against me. Those are things. They can be replaced." He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "But you," he said, his voice dropping, losing its anger, becoming something else, something raw and vulnerable. "He is trying to take you from me because he knows. He finally figured it out." "Figured what out?" she whispered. "That you are the most valuable thing on this ranch," Silas said. "And he is terrified of you." He looked down at the bundle in her hands. "So you can leave," he said quietly. "You can walk away, just like I promised. Or you can stay, and we can finish this together." He did not try to convince her. He did not plead. He just stood there, burned and ruined, offering her a choice. Alara looked at the smoldering barn, at the ashes of Silas's livelihood. Then she looked at him, at the man who had run into a fire for someone else, the man who saw her worth when no one else had, not even herself. Slowly, deliberately, she let the bundle of her belongings drop to the ground. "Together," she said. The fire was Finch's final, catastrophic move. It was meant to break Silas completely, to force him into foreclosure before winter. The loss of the hay meant he would have to sell his herd for a pittance. Finch had already made an offer to the bank to buy Silas's debt. A hearing was set at the county seat in 2 days to formalize the transfer of the lien. It was a legal proceeding, a foreclosure hearing, but it would take place in the town hall, publicly. It was designed to be the final humiliation. Silas had made his choice in front of that fire. He had chosen Finn's life over his livelihood without a moment of hesitation. That act, witnessed by his men, had solidified their loyalty into something unbreakable. They would have followed him into the fire itself. It had also solidified Alara's resolve. Her fight was no longer just for her own survival or even for justice. It was for him. For this place. For this quiet, decent man who thought she was valuable. They had one day. While Silas and the men salvaged what little they could and cared for the spooked animals, Alara worked. She took the ranch's original survey map, a faded document from Silas's father's time. She took her own notes, her copied invoices, and the statement from the clerk at the supply store. She spent hours with the map, her finger tracing the path of the Whispering Creek. She was looking for something, a final piece of the puzzle that would turn her data into an undeniable narrative of guilt. The creek originated on federal land in the hills, flowed through a corner of Finch's property, then crossed into the Whispering Creek Ranch. The sinkhole she had found was on Silas's land. But what if it was not the only one? She remembered Jeb's words. Springs don't just go dry in a week. The flow had been diminishing for longer than that. The sinkhole had been a sudden, catastrophic event, but the creek had been weakening for months before. She looked at the map again, at the section of creek on Finch's land. Her eyes narrowed. She went to Silas. I need to ride up to the North Ridge, the one that overlooks Finch's upper pasture. He looked at her, questioning. He underestimated me, she said. I think he underestimated the land, too. Silas saddled 2 horses without another word. They rode in silence, taking a long, circuitous route to avoid being seen. From the rocky crest of the ridge, they had a clear view down into the valley that held Finch's property. His ranch was a picture of prosperity. Green pastures, fat cattle, a large, pristine white house, and a new reservoir. It was tucked away in a small canyon, gleaming in the sun, almost invisible from the main road. A wide, deep pool of water. It was being fed by a diversion channel. A channel that came directly from the Whispering Creek. He damned it, Silas said, his voice a low, cold whisper. On his own land. He's been stealing the water at its source. Not stealing, Alara corrected softly, her mind racing. Diverting. There's a difference in the law. A man can divert water on his own property, as long as he doesn't deny access to those downstream. He denied me access, Silas said, his jaw tight. He will say the creek dried up naturally, Alara countered, thinking it through. He will say his diversion is small, and the real problem was the sinkhole on your land. It will be his word against ours. She stared at the reservoir, at the landscape. Something was wrong with the picture. Something was out of place. And then she saw it. It was a small detail. A line of freshly turned earth, leading away from the far side of the reservoir. It was not a channel for irrigation. It was too deep, and it headed uphill. What is that? She asked, pointing. Silas squinted. Looks like a pipeline trench. A pipeline, leading from a reservoir fed by a creek. It made no sense. Unless the reservoir was not the real goal. Alara's mind made the final, crucial leap. The mining camp, she breathed. The one Thompson was going to sell my contract to. The camp was 5 miles east, in the dry hills. They had no reliable water source. It was the one thing holding back their expansion. Finch isn't a rancher, Alara said, the entire conspiracy laying itself bare in her mind. He's a water broker. He's been trying to force you out, not just to get your land, but to get your water rights. All of them. He's going to sell the entire flow of the Whispering Creek to the mining company. The dam, the sabotage, the fire, it was all part of a single, audacious, and incredibly profitable plan. He has a contract, she realized. He must have a signed contract with the mining company, and it's probably contingent on him securing full rights to the creek, which is what the foreclosure hearing was for. He can't win, Silas said. The water rights are tied to the land. They're 100 years old. He's not trying to win in a fair fight, Alara said. He has the bank on his side. He has the sheriff. He thinks he has you broken. He will push the foreclosure through, and by the time you could mount a legal challenge, the water will be gone and the deal will be done. She looked from the hidden reservoir to Silas's grim face. But he made a mistake, she said, a cold, hard smile touching her lips for the first time. He told everyone the creek was drying up. He told the sheriff. He told the bank. He told the whole town. He built his entire case on the idea that the water was disappearing naturally. It was, Silas said. He was making it disappear. Exactly, Alara said. And a man who believes a creek is failing does not spend a fortune building a reservoir to catch its last drops and a pipeline to sell it. His entire narrative was a lie, and his own actions were the proof. The hearing was held in the main room of the town hall. It was packed. The entire town was there, drawn by the drama of a man's ruin. It was the same crowd, the same faces that had watched her on the auction block. They were here for the final act of the tragedy. Alastair Finch sat at a table at the front, next to a portly banker and the county commissioner. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his face a mask of solemn concern. He looked like a man performing a sad but necessary duty. Silas sat at the other table, alone. Alara sat in the first row of public seating, directly behind him. She held a simple, leather-bound portfolio on her lap. The commissioner, a man clearly in Finch's pocket, ran through the proceedings quickly. The debt was clear. The default was undeniable after the loss of the barn. It was a simple, open-and-shut case of foreclosure. Does the debtor, Mr. Silas Kane, have anything to say before we finalize the transfer of the lien to Mr. Alastair Finch? The commissioner asked, his tone bored. Silas stood up. He was wearing his clean but worn work clothes. He looked out of place, a piece of rough earth in a room of polished wood. I do, he said, his voice calm and steady. I would like to call a witness. The commissioner looked annoyed. This is not a trial, Mr. Kane. This is a public hearing, Silas countered. And the public has a right to hear the truth. He turned and looked at Alara. I call Alara, he said. A murmur went through the crowd. The talking mule. The housekeeper. What could she possibly have to say? Finch's confident smile tightened. He shot Alara a look of pure, condescending pity. Alara stood up and walked to the front of the room. She stood beside Silas, facing the commissioner, facing Finch, facing the town. She opened her portfolio. My name is Alara, she began, her voice shaking only for a moment before it steadied, filled with a cold, clear authority. I am the bookkeeper for the Whispering Creek Ranch. She started with the numbers. She did not speak of betrayal or friendship. She spoke of invoices, of delivery costs, of cattle weights. She laid out the methodical, financial exsanguination of the ranch, her voice calm and precise, the voice of a mathematician explaining a proof. She held up the forged invoices and the real ones, showing the discrepancies. She read the statement from the clerk. The room grew quiet. The boredom was replaced by a tense, focused interest. Finch's smile was gone. He looked irritated, but not worried. It was the word of a disgraced woman against his. Then Alara moved to the water. She unrolled the survey map and tacked it to an easel. Mr. Finch has told many people, including the sheriff and the bank, that the Whispering Creek has been failing for months due to natural causes, she said, her voice ringing through the silent hall. He presented this as a reason for the ranch's decline. He argued that the land was becoming worthless. She pointed to the map. This is the creek. Mr. Finch recently built a dam and a diversion channel here, on his property. Finch stood up. I have every right to divert water on my own land. This is irrelevant. The woman is creating a fantasy. Is it a fantasy, Mr. Finch? Alara asked, her voice dangerously soft. Is it a fantasy that you have a contract with the Black Hills Mining Company to sell them the full water rights to the Whispering Creek, contingent on you acquiring this lien today? A gasp went through the crowd. The banker and the commissioner shifted uncomfortably. Finch's face went pale. That is a lie. It is a slanderous accusation. Then perhaps you can explain this, Alara said, her voice rising, taking command of the room. Why would a man spend thousands of dollars to build a new reservoir and a pipeline to capture water from a creek that he, himself, has been telling everyone is worthless and drying up? The question landed in the center of the room like a stone. The logic was inescapable. The contradiction was absolute. You do not build a bucket to catch the rain in the middle of a drought you engineered. The crowd began to murmur, the tide of their opinion shifting audibly. They looked from Alara's fierce, intelligent face to Finch's suddenly sweating one. Finch saw the room turning against him. His polish cracked. His charm evaporated. All that was left was a raw, panicked fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Alara. You will listen to this fat, worthless piece of livestock? He snarled, his voice a venomous hiss that carried to every corner of the hall. This cast-off that he picked up for a few dollars? Her word against mine? A Finch of Blackwood County. It was his final, fatal mistake. In that single, vitriolic outburst, he confirmed everything. His arrogance, his cruelty, his contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him. He had shown the entire town the monster behind the charming mask. The room fell into a dead, shocked silence. Alara did not flinch. She stood her ground, looking at him not with fear, but with a calm, devastating pity. She had won. He had defeated himself. Gee. The silence in the hall was broken by a single, authoritative voice. It was not the commissioner. It was an old, respected rancher from the back of the room, a man whose family had worked this land for a century. "I think we've heard enough," he said, his voice a low rumble of disgust. He stood up, and then another man stood, and another. The commissioner, seeing his political future evaporating before his eyes, began to backpedal furiously. The banker suddenly found his shoes fascinating. A federal marshal, who had been observing the proceedings from the doorway at the request of the mining company's nervous competitors, stepped forward. The public hearing about a foreclosure had become a public revelation of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted arson. Alastair Finch was not arrested immediately, but his ruin was absolute. Investigations were launched. His contracts were frozen. His reputation, the currency he valued above all else, was rendered worthless in the space of a single afternoon. He was undone not by a punch or a bullet, but by a woman with a ledger and a map. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with the scandal, Silas stood quietly beside Alara. He did not touch her, did not speak. He simply stood as a silent, solid presence at her side, letting the victory be entirely hers. She was momentarily overwhelmed by the noise, by the looks of newfound respect and awe from the very people who had scorned her. She heard a woman whisper, "My God, she's brilliant." The sound was so alien, so contrary to the soundtrack of her life, that it almost brought her to her knees. Silas saw it. He put a steadying hand on the small of her back. A simple, grounding touch. "Let's go home," he said. They walked out of the town hall and into the afternoon sun, leaving the wreckage of Alastair Finch's life behind them. They did not speak on the ride back to the Whispering Creek. There was nothing that needed to be said. The silence was not empty. It was full of relief, of exhaustion, of a shared, hard-won peace. When they arrived, Jeb and the boys were waiting in the yard. They knew. The news had already traveled, carried on the wind. Jeb walked up to Alara. He looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he reached out and awkwardly patted her on the shoulder. "Good work, girl," he said. From Jeb, it was a sonnet. The next few weeks were a time of rebuilding. The community, in a collective act of penance, organized a barn raising. Men who had once looked at Silas with pity now came to offer their labor and their lumber. Women who had whispered about Alara now came to the ranch house with pies and preserves, their offerings a form of silent apology. Alara accepted it all with a quiet, distant grace. She did not need their approval anymore. She had her own. One evening, a month after the hearing, Silas found her on the porch. She was watching the sun set over the hills, the new frame of the barn a dark, hopeful skeleton against the painted sky. He sat in the chair beside her, not speaking for a long time. Then he placed a folded piece of paper on the small table between them. "I want to see the lawyer today," he said. She looked at the paper. It was a legal document. A deed. "The north pasture," he said, his voice quiet. "The one with the spring. And the 20 acres around it. It's yours." Alara stared at the deed, her name written on it in neat, official script. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice tight. "It is not a gift," Silas said firmly, meeting her gaze. "It is your share. You earned it. You saved it. It belongs to you." He paused, his gaze steady and serious. "This is not a payment for services rendered, Alara, and it is not a proposal of marriage. It is an acknowledgement of a fact. This land is as much yours as it is mine." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. "I am not asking you to stay because you owe me anything," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You owe me nothing. You are free, just like I promised on the first day." He took a breath. "I am asking you to stay because I want you to. Because this place is better with you in it. Because I am better with you in it. I am asking you to choose to stay. As a partner. As an equal." The word hung in the twilight air. Partner. It was a word that held everything she had ever wanted without knowing how to ask. Respect. Value. A place to stand that was earned, not given. She looked from the deed, from the legal proof of her worth, to his face. She saw no pity there, no transaction. She saw only a quiet, steady hope. She saw a man asking, not demanding. She thought of the vow she had made in that dusty alley, the promise to trust no one but herself. She had kept that vow. She had trusted herself, her mind, her own strength, and it had led her here, to a place where she no longer had to be a fortress. She could be a home. "I have nowhere else I would rather be," she said, her voice soft but sure. She was not accepting a gift. She was not surrendering to an obligation. She was making a choice. She was choosing this land, this man, this life. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his weary features. It was the first time she had ever seen it. He did not speak. He simply reached across the space between them and laid his calloused, warm hand over hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. They sat there together in the gathering dark, in a comfortable, shared silence. They watched the first stars appear in the vast, clear sky above their ranch. Her ranch. The house was quiet behind them. The land was healing around them. And for the first time in her life, Elara felt the profound, unshakable peace of being exactly where she was meant to be. She was home.